few years ago, the life group that my wife and I are in came across the discussion of Sabbath in Hebrews. We decided to do a deep dive together because this was something that was somewhat new to us. We were all surprised at what we discovered. Much of our modern evangelical upbringing had somehow left this essential practice out, and it caused me to wonder why. I thought maybe it's possible that over the ages, we've just determined that these were ancient practices for back then. Or maybe only for the spiritually elite, monks or nuns. Maybe it's even been confusing to us why our New Testament writers record Jesus often having harsh things to say to the religious leaders about Sabbath, which has caused us to shy away from the practice altogether. Or maybe it's because some of us were raised in a super legalistic church when it came to spiritual practices. It'll be difficult to recover what I feel like has been lost in the church today around this practice in just one discussion. But I hope at the very least it sparks a curiosity for those who've missed out, adds a perspective to those who've already been practicing it, and overall affirms to us as the church that this is an essential pathway the Lord wants to use in our formation into His image. And personally, I would like you to just consider me a fellow traveler on this journey as well, inviting you to come and see what we might be missing out on when we don't Sabbath. And much of what I'll be sharing is a result of just the beginning of my own discovery of the sweetness of Sabbath. And the following thoughts are from a host of many voices, so I don't take credit for much of what follows. For our time, I'd like us first to consider our need for Sabbath. Next, we'll discuss a practical theology of the Sabbath. And lastly, we'll conclude with how we might best practice integrating Sabbath into the rhythm of our lives. So first, why do we need Sabbath? How many of you have heard something said in the last week along these lines? Or maybe it was you yourself saying it. But when asked, how are you? The response is good, but busy. We're busy people, and it's common for us to respond and to hear that phrase. But because we're busy, many of us struggle to have a healthy relationship with rest. We either don't rest until it's a crisis, or we have to, or we don't rest well enough, or we don't rest long enough. Dallas Willard offers that hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. I remember feeling so frustrated in a season of my life where I realized I couldn't seem to get everything done within the day that I wanted to get done. And if only I didn't have to sleep, I could have this extra 8 hours to be more useful to the world rather than useless. The Western world's formation of us has taught us to live beyond our limits, and it's often our busyness that leads us to burnout. Busyness, by the way, doesn't discriminate age or stage of life or race. There's an endless demand for our attention, our energy, our finances, our compassion, and it's more than we have to give on our own. Writer and teacher Parker Palmer states in his book, Let Your Life Speak, that burnout is a state of emptiness to be sure, but it doesn't result from giving all that I have. It merely reveals the nothingness from which I was trying to give in the first place. God has a response He wants us to employ to help us fight busyness and protect us from burnout, and it's called the Sabbath. And it's so much more than that too. So what is our practical theology of the Sabbath? This by no means is an all-inclusive definition of Sabbath. We're actually only going to cover a fraction. And so my encouragement to you, if this is something new to you, is just to keep studying. But let's begin with what Sabbath is. In order to do that, we have to turn back to the Old Testament, looking specifically at the nation of Israel, where we learn that there was a period of time for 400 years where they were enslaved to the nation of Egypt. They were shaped by this tyranny of an identity driven by their work and what they could do. We know from the book of Exodus that God delivered them from this enslavement, and He actually sent them into the wilderness as a gracious act so that they could have space to unlearn so that they could relearn. And it was in the wilderness that God gave them the 10 Commandments, not for salvation or earn His approval or to get His attention, but a way of living into the life that described who they were as God's redeemed people. And the Sabbath is in those commandments. The Exodus narrative of Sabbath is that God wants His people to remember. We see that in Exodus 28. But if you flip forward to the book of Deuteronomy and look at chapter 5, verse 12, it describes the Sabbath as something to observe. The wilderness was a space that God used to help Israel unlearn so that they could remember and return to God. And after that, it was important for them to learn how to observe so that they could preserve their identity in God. Rich Velotis, who's a pastor in Queens, comments in his book, The Deeply Formed Life, that the brilliance of the Sabbath keeping is not so much about our keeping the Sabbath as it is about the Sabbath keeping us. Jewish history is not just history. It also teaches us today that in order to honor God with our lives and identify with Him, we too need to remember, to unlearn so that we can return to Him, so that we can observe and live in a way that God is central to our daily life. And Sabbath is a practice that helps us with that. The word Sabbath means literally to stop and is often practiced in the span of 24 hours. But stop what? John Mark Comer puts it like this: to stop want, worry, and work. To stop want means, for example, that we're not shopping, we're not scrolling our social media feed, we're not flipping through magazines or watching HGTV. I don't know about you, but when I watch any home improvement show, I often enjoy my home way less. Stopping want allows us space to practice gratitude. But to stop worry means that we might also, for example, need to take a break from the news. Stopping worry allows us to put our trust in God, who is in control. Sabbath is also space for us to stop work, which means that we have 24 hours of no have-tos or no ought-tos. Eugene Peterson talks about Sabbath in his book, Working the Angles, and says that Sabbath keeping often feels like an interruption, an interference with our routines, and it challenges assumptions that we gradually build up that our daily work is indispensable and is making the world go. Stopping work allows us to stop pretending we're God. And a great prayer to begin your Sabbath with is called benevolent detachment. It could sound something like this: Jesus, I give everyone and everything to you. Sabbath is more than just what we don't do. Stopping is actually just part one. There's a ministry in the Sabbath as well. And the first ministry of the Sabbath is that it reveals things about me and about God. Now, we might be tempted to think that once we get to the day, all of a sudden we're going to transcend into this peaceful state and remain that way for 24 hours. However, it's amazing what comes up for me when I slow down. And it's key that we learn how to pay attention to what comes up, what God is revealing to us about ourselves and about Him when we stop. But the ministry of the Sabbath doesn't stop there. It's also a day fueled by rest and worship. Sabbath is a way for us to sort of turn up the volume of our worship of God as we enjoy the good things we were made to enjoy. So we use this day to do activities that fill our soul and cause us to deeply enjoy the giver of all good gifts, like food and naps and nature and family and friends and creating and recreating. It's a day for us to get so caught up in delight. Have you ever seen kids that get so into an activity that they lose track of the world around them? That is the kind of Sabbath the Father delights to see us enjoy. The third ministry of the Sabbath is that it's our weapon for resiliency in the world. Dallas Willard says that we must arrange our lives in a way so that sin no longer looks good to us, and Sabbath is our weekly training that helps us to learn not to be impressed with what the world offers apart from God. I mean, how easy is it to tempt a tired person or an unsatisfied person? There's a reason why dessert before bed always sounds really good. I heard a pastor share a story about a Nazi soldier's journal that was found, and he talked about the Jews practicing the Sabbath in a concentration camp. And there's a particular page where he was writing his commander, stating what he observed in his time with the Jews is that it was in their best interest to disrupt their Sabbath keeping. Because when they were able to keep the Sabbath, he observed, it was like they got their spirits back. Can you picture that level of resiliency? The fourth ministry of the Sabbath is that it gives us a taste of heaven. When we take a day to stop work and worry and want, we open ourselves up to enjoying God, and we're inviting heaven to come to earth. When we Sabbath, we're embracing the present reality of God's rest and the future hope that we someday get to enter it fully and forever. So we're just talking about what the Sabbath is, but let's now close with talking about what the Sabbath is not. The Sabbath is not just a day off. Taking a day off is part of it, and if that's all we're doing when we Sabbath, we're actually missing the heart of the time altogether. It's a day fueled by rest and worship. The Sabbath is also not a set of rules. It's actually just made up of a collection of best practices. Many of us fear becoming too religious, and we end up avoiding the discipline of spiritual practices as a result. But Sabbath doesn't come with a set of rules, rather just a way for us to live. The religious leaders had this all mixed up too, and Jesus addresses them in Mark 2:27 when he says, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." So especially as you practice and discuss Sabbath in community, you'll realize just how much variance there can be to this practice. Thirdly, the Sabbath is not a reward for hard work. Sometimes we might only Sabbath if we feel like we've worked hard enough or we've earned it. And if anything, the Sabbath is a reminder that the work is always going to remain incomplete. Have you ever found yourself saying, when I finish everything on my list, then I'll rest? Yeah, me too. But the Sabbath is a weekly challenge that'll help us stay on guard against believing that we are only as good as what we can produce. Sabbath shapes us to enjoy the limits of our humanity rather than to grasp trying to be God. And if you're like me, an unmade bed on the Sabbath can be a visual reminder that God still loves me, even though I wasn't able to finish all the work I wanted to today. Lastly, Sabbath is not a religious hobby. See, the danger in talking about these things is we can know enough to be dangerous, meaning we can know how to acknowledge the truth and good about Sabbath rest and rhythm. We can maybe even occasionally practice it. We can learn how to talk about it with others, maybe even advocate it, but only as an acquaintance with the practice rather than what we're actually invited to in this practice, which isn't just a temporary change in our lives. It's an invitation for deep transformative work to be done in us so that it's not just something that we do, but rather a way we reshape how we think and see and live. And it takes practice. So let's talk about the practice of the Sabbath. If the Sabbath is something new to you, how do you put it into practice? The J curve teaches us that when we start something new, we often get worse before we get better. So give yourself grace. Try to think of it in longer spans of time, not just week to week, but maybe in the span of a couple of months or a year or even 3 to 5 years as you assess how it's going. And also remember, it's in the name. It's a practice, and therefore it takes practice. And it's best nourished, like most spiritual practices are, when it's done within a community. So in conclusion, Sabbath is a day to stop, work, worry, and want, so that we can remember and observe through rest and worship who we are and who God is. Theologian N.T. Wright says, it's only when we slow down our lives that we can catch up with God. And Sabbath is a practice that helps us to do that.